Anyone who believes in indefinite growth on a physically finite planet is either mad or an economist.
We don't want to focus politics on a notion that involves the rejection of principles around which a large majority of our fellow citizens organize their lives.
We are not as endlessly manipulable and as predictable as you would think.
The 20th century I see as the age of introspection. That was the era in which the self-help industry and therapy culture told us that the best way to discover who we are and what to do with our lives was to look inside ourselves, to gaze at our own navels. And combined with the idea of capitalist individualism in the 20th century, that pointed us towards pursuing the good life through self-interest and pursuing luxury lifestyles. And what we've discovered, of course, is that that has not delivered the good life to most of us. So the 21st century needs to be different. Instead of the age of introspection, we need to shift to the age of outrospection. And by outrospection, I mean the idea of discovering who you are and what to do with your life by stepping outside yourself, discovering the lives of other people, other civilizations. And the ultimate art form for the age of outrospection is empathy. Empathy isn't just something that makes you good, that expands your moral universe. Empathy is something that's good for you, that can make you a more creative thinker, improve your relationships, can create the human bonds that make life worth living. But more than that, empathy is also about social change, radical social change. A lot of people think of empathy as sort of a nice, soft, fluffy concept. I think it's anything but that. I think it's actually quite dangerous, because empathy can create revolution. Not one of those old-fashioned revolutions of new states, policies, governments, laws, but something much more fiery and dangerous, which is a revolution of human relationships. Now, it might seem strange to try and base a whole philosophy of life or an agenda for radical social change on an idea like empathy, because we've been told by our culture for the last 300 or 400 years that, in fact, we're not really empathic beings. We are essentially self-interested, self-seeking creatures. In the last 20 years, there have been incredibly important advances in scientific thinking in various realms, which is revealing to us that we are not just self-interested creatures, but we are also homo empathicus. We are empathic beings, and we have an empathic side which exists alongside our selfish inner drives. You find this idea partly in evolutionary biology. For example, in the works of Frans de Waal up there, his book The Age of Empathy, where he says that we have naturally developed evolutionarily to be cooperative, community-oriented creatures for self-defense, for food security. We've needed to work together. We've needed to empathize with each other, not only human beings, but a hippie-like bonobo chimp who are very friendly towards one another, and other creatures too. Equally, the neuroscientists have been telling us about that we may well have empathy circuitry in our brains, and if part of our brains are damaged, then we may well lose our empathic capacities, and that we are born with an empathic circuitry, and it develops early in childhood. Psychologists, of course, have been thinking about empathy, writing about it for over a century, but it's in the last couple of decades, again, there's been a new wave of research showing that even 2-year-olds have this ability to step into the shoes of another person. So if I think of my own children, when they were quite young, when they were, say, 1.5, if my daughter, I've got 2-year-old twins, if my daughter saw her brother being unhappy, if he was crying, she may well go and give her own teddy to him to comfort him. That's what she used to do. But once she became a bit older, about 2.5 or 3, instead of giving her own teddy as a comfort, she went and got his teddy and gave it to her, because she had then made that cognitive leap that what really mattered to him was his own comforting toy. But with that scientific background in mind, now I think we need to go beyond that and start thinking about how to apply empathy to our own lives, to social and political change. And that's where the 6 habits of highly empathic people come in. The first one is to cultivate curiosity about strangers. We make assumptions about people. We have prejudices about people which block us from seeing their uniqueness, their individuality. We use labels, whether it's a working class miner or a single mother or Muslim extremist, even greedy banker. And highly empathic people get beyond those labels by nurturing their curiosity about others. Of course, we're not in many ways very good at that. I mean, you probably don't know that many people on your own street where you live very well. We're not very good at being curious about our neighbors. So how might we nurture our curiosity? Where can we find inspiration? I think we can find inspiration in George Orwell. You might remember or might know that he came from a very privileged background. He was a colonial police officer in Burma. But what he realized in his 20s was that he knew very little about his own country, particularly about the way that those people living on the social margins really experienced life. So he decided to do something about it and conduct one of the most brilliant empathy experiments, which was to go tramping on the streets of East London. He, in the late 20s and early 30s, he used to dress up as a tramp in a shabby coat and holed shoes, go out absolutely penniless, and spend his time on the streets with vagabonds and beggars and others, sometimes for a few days, sometimes for weeks at a time. But the important thing about Orwell's experience was that it not only expanded his moral universe, he became a more compassionate person to beggars and other people living down and out, but it also cultivated his curiosity about strangers. He developed new friendships. He gathered a whole load of literary materials he used for the rest of his life. In a way, this empathy adventure, it made him good, but it was also good for him. Habit 2 is to challenge prejudices and discover commonalities. Highly empathic people tend to be looking for what they share with others, not what divides them. Let me give you an example. His name was C.P. Ellis, Claiborne Paul Ellis. He was born in 1927 in the county of Durham, North Carolina. He was from a poor white working class background, and like his father before him, he decided to blame his problems on the African American population, on black people. And like his father before him, he joined the Ku Klux Klan. He rose through the ranks. He became the exalted Cyclops of his local chapter of the Ku Klux Klan. C.P. Ellis was invited to a community meeting in his town to tackle racial problems in schools. He was invited because he was a prominent local figure. He was elected co-chair with a woman who he hated with a purple passion, which was this black civil rights activist, Ann Atwater. And they thought there's no way that they're going to be able to work with each other. But something astonishing happened. They spent a few days trying to recruit people onto their race committee. C.P. Ellis went out knocking on doors of his white supremacist friends, and he came back and said to Ann Atwater, you know, I've been knocking on the doors, and nobody wants to talk to me. No one wants to be part of this because I'm spending my time with a black civil rights activist. And Ann Atwater said, same thing happened to me. I've been knocking on the doors in the black community. No one would speak to me because I was speaking with a known Klansman. And then C.P. Ellis said, you know, my son came home from crying from school yesterday because a white liberal teacher made fun of him because of what I was doing working with you. And Ann Atwater said, yesterday the same thing happened to my daughter. She was being made fun of by the kids at school because I was spending my time with a KKK member. They discovered they had things in common. They actually discovered, more importantly, that they shared the oppression of poverty. This encounter exploded C.P. Ellis's prejudices. He recognized that he shared a lot with this other person, that she was just another human being. In fact, at the end of the 10-day community meeting, he stood up in front of 1,000 people and he tore up his Ku Klux Klan membership card. He later became a prominent civil rights activist, a leader of a union that was 70% black, and they became friends for the rest of their lives. But it's an example of the way that even the greatest prejudices can be overcome with an empathic connection. Now, I've talked quite a lot about really the attitudes required for empathy, but what about in practice? What should we really do to become more empathic in our imaginations? I think we need to get into extreme sport. Not the normal extreme sports of ice climbing and abseiling and so on, but the extreme sport of experiential empathy, really trying to be in somebody else's life. The woman up there on the screen, her name's Patricia Moore. She's now a very famous US industrial designer. When she was 26, she was working in New York for a firm called Raymond Loewy, who invented the Coca-Cola bottle and the Shell logo. And she was in a meeting with some of the partners. She was the only woman working there at the time in the 70s. And in this meeting, when they were talking about the design of fridge doors, she said, couldn't we design the refrigerator door so that someone with arthritis would find it easy to open? And one of the partners at the meeting said, you know, Paddy, we just don't design for those people. And she was incensed by this idea that these elderly people would be ignored in the design process. So she decided to conduct an experiment really worthy of George Orwell. She decided to dress up as an 80-year-old. She got a professional makeup artist to make her look 80 years old. She put on thick glasses, which were distorted so she couldn't see properly. And when she went out into the world, this is what she looked like. Between 1979 and 1982, visited over 100 US cities, dressed as an 80-year-old to discover what was it like, how would you be treated. Out of this experiment, she came up with a new concept of design, the idea of universal design, that things should be designed for people from all backgrounds, all classes, all age groups, designed to be non-discriminatory. She came up with particular inventions. You know, like those thick-gripped can openers you can get, the Oxo Good Grip. That was her invention from her experiment as an 80-year-old. Now, there's a fourth habit, which is to practice the art of conversation. Highly empathic people tend to be very sensitive listeners. They're very good at understanding what somebody else's needs are. There tend to be also people who, in conversations, share part of their own lives, make conversations two-way dialogues, open their emotions, make themselves vulnerable. This is the motto of a grassroots peace-building organization in Israel and the Palestinian territories called the Parents' Circle, or the Bereaved Families Forum, they're sometimes called. What it does is bring together Palestinian and Israeli families who share something very special. These families have all lost members of their own families in the conflict. There might be an Israeli graphic designer whose daughter was blown up by a Palestinian suicide bomber, a Palestinian family whose son was shot by an Israeli sniper. And the Parents' Circle brings them together for conversations, picnics, meetings where they share each other's stories. They discover that they share the same pain, the same blood. They make that empathic bond. They also have other fantastic projects. My favorite one is called Hello Peace. And it's a free phone telephone line. So anybody can pick up and call that number. If you're a Palestinian and call it, you're immediately put through to an Israeli. You can have a half-hour conversation. If you're an Israeli, pick it up, you're put through to a Palestinian. Since 2002, over 1 million calls have been logged on the Hello Peace free phone line. That's the kind of project which is trying to create grassroots empathy, and we need to think about. The last 1,000 years of history of the globe, I think not of the rise and fall of civilizations and religions or political systems. I think of the rise and fall of empathy. Moments of mass empathic flowering, and also, of course, of empathic collapse. As you probably know, in the 1780s in Britain, slavery was an accepted part of society. People felt that the economy was as dependent on slavery as our economy is on oil today. 500,000 African slaves were being worked to death on British plantations in the Caribbean, sugar plantations. Everybody had this sugar in their teas. And nobody thought this could ever be eroded, this institution of slavery. It was totally normal. It seemed impossible to get rid of. But in the late 1780s, there was the rise of the world's first great human rights movement, the movement against slavery and the slave trade. And it was a movement powered by empathy. Its leaders, Quaker businessmen, an Anglican archdeacon, and others, developed a very empathic campaign. The idea they had was to try and get people in Britain to experience or understand, at least, what it was like to be a slave on a slave ship, on a slave plantation. They published written accounts with sort of oral stories of former slaves talking about what it was like to be sort of whipped until they were lying on the ground. They organized for former slaves to give talks around Britain about their experiences. And this led to a sort of revolutionary social movement, really. It led to petitions, it led to public protests, it led to the first great fair trade boycott of sugar in the late 18th century. Eventually, it led to the abolition of the slave trade in 1807 and later slavery itself. But we need to think about one final habit, which is to develop an ambitious imagination. We normally think of empathy as empathizing with the down and outs, the poor and marginalized, those on the edges of society. I think we need to be more adventurous in who we try to empathize with. I think we need to empathize with those in power, even greedy bankers like Dick Folds here, formerly from Lehman Brothers. We need to understand how those in power, in whatever realm it is, think about the world and their lives and their ambitions. We need to understand their values. Only then are we going to be able to develop effective strategies for social, political, and economic transformation. Equally, I think we need to, have conversations with people like, who are elites, try and share our own lives, try and bridge those divides. It doesn't mean we have to adopt their views, but we do need to understand their views of the world. Equally, I think we need to apply our more ambitious thinking in policy realms, such as thinking about climate change. We all know there's a huge gap between what we know about climate change and the amount of action that people are taking, i.e. not very much. I think that gap is explained by empathy in two forms. I think there's an empathic gap in terms of we're not empathizing across space with people in developing countries like in India, people who are being hit by climate change-induced floods or droughts in Kenya. Equally, and almost more importantly perhaps, we are failing to empathize through time with future generations. We're hopeless at putting ourselves into the shoes of future generations and adjusting our behavior after doing that. And I think we need to learn to expand our empathic imaginations forwards through time as well as across space. Socrates said that the way to live a wise and good life was to know thyself. And we've generally thought of that as being about being self-reflective, looking in at ourselves. It's been about introspection. But I think in the 21st century, we need to recognize that to know thyself is something that can also be achieved by stepping outside yourself, by discovering other people's lives. And I think empathy is the way to revolutionize our own philosophies of life, to become more outrospective, and to create the revolution of human relationships that I think we so desperately need.
Living in London, for example, or any other big city, you're absolutely, engorged in other people's thoughts and feelings all the time. And most of us survive by broadly screening them out. What do you say to someone who says, I just can't do it, I just don't have the capacity, it's too much for an individual to bear?
If you pick up a psychology textbook again, you won't only see definitions of empathy, but you also see probably a concept called empathic over-arousal. That is something that occurs to people who are engaged in professions often where they are inundated with other people's thoughts and feelings and pains. So, for example, nurses working on cancer wards, for example, often can experience this sort of over-arousal. It is just all too much. Humanitarian aid workers equally. Those kinds of people tend to find ways of dealing with it. They often, are very good at sort of switching off, erecting a kind of an emotional barrier so they just get on with their jobs, because they do realize that it can be too much. And I think that is something worth thinking about. But that kind of overload really only happens to quite a small minority of people. The real problem is that we are not doing enough of the stepping outside of ourselves into other people's lives. That we maybe have this fear that it could all be too much for us. But I think what the empirical sort of evidence shows, the experience shows, that when people do try to make these empathic bonds, you create relationships which really matter to people. And that sense of overload of it being too much doesn't seem so damaging anymore.
People saying, I know how you feel. And that sometimes being a lovely tonic, and sometimes being a kind of invasion or presumption that isn't welcome. And I'm concerned that, if you view the world through your own eyes, there's a classic statement that we see the world not as this is, but as we are. And likewise, if we begin to try and empathize with lots of people without having, a lot of personal experience or highly developed sense of empathy, there's a real danger that people start assuming they know what's going on with other people as part of this broad empathetic mission. But in fact, they're just layering on their own assumptions and actually sometimes compounding problems.
Yes, and I've seen it happen. I've talked to people, for example, who have said, I'm a real, empathizer by nature. When I went to Soweto, I went and visited a shanty town. And you say, well, what was it like? Well, we went around in this SUV, and we didn't actually get out of the car. We looked through the windows. And I think that's the problem with a certain kind of empathizing, that it can be quite voyeuristic.
Right.
And the danger there is that you are often then imposing your own views on it because you're not going far enough.
Right.
And that's why in my work I try to emphasize the importance of experiential empathy, because that's the one which is the hardest to do, but it's the one that changes us most.